Today I'm going to be watching another interesting video about the Netherlands, and this time it is this 10 Dutch culture shocks in the Netherlands. So I find these types of videos interesting because I'm British, I live in Malaysia, so of course I suffered some culture shocks myself. I always like to see other people's experience in different countries, see what shocks them. You can tell me if you're from the Netherlands what you think about these 10 things. Tell me if there's any other things that you think might cause a culture shock to people coming to the Netherlands. Let's watch this and we can learn about these ones.
Hey, it's David and welcome back to my channel. Today, let's talk about culture shocks in the Netherlands. A little bit about myself because culture shocks are always relative. I'm originally from California, but I've been studying, living, and working in the Netherlands for the past 3.5 years now. And that's the beautiful thing about culture shocks is that it's part of the experience of living abroad, studying abroad, and these are my experiences and opinions. So let's start with something big. Let's talk about racism in the Netherlands. Yes, racism. The Netherlands, one of the most open, progressive, diverse countries in the world. Yes, there still exists racism. Well, in fact, racism, it's a global thing. The thing about racism here, in my opinion, is that while it might seem very blatant and obvious, a form of racism here in the Netherlands, for many Dutch people, they don't see it that way. They don't see the wrong in it. Let me explain.
Black Pete is usually portrayed by white people in black face paint, wearing frizzy wigs and red lipstick. It is criticized for being racist.
So we can't talk about racism without talking about the sensitive topic of Zwarte Piet, Black Pete, or blackface. But that was and still is a big cultural shock for me, seeing all these black faces during December time. So there's this Dutch tradition where they celebrate Santa Claus. Santa Claus, or Saint Nicholas, an elderly white person, comes to town with his little helpers, these Zwarte Piets or Black Piets, and they go around town passing out candy to children. And the tradition is that adult and children will paint their faces black, wear wigs, dress up, and paint their lips red to imitate Black Pete. And for me, coming as an outsider, especially from the US, when I first saw a Black Pete, I was just shocked. I knew about it, but seeing it in person was even more shocking. And I know nobody really knows where Black Pete came from. He could come from the slave trade, or he is black because he came down a chimney and the suit made his face black. But the fact is, we live in the 21st century and there's actually a lot of black people living in the Netherlands. It just seems a bit old-fashioned to see people, white people, paint their faces black and imitate a Black Pete. And by no means is this the fault of children. Children know nothing about race. They just want candy, they just want to have fun. But it's really a tradition that you have to think about. We live in the 21st century, and imagine yourself as a black person growing up in the Netherlands, and during this Santa Claus time, your friends and people around you are dressed up and they're painting their faces black. How would that feel? I don't know, but it just feels a little bit wrong, especially in a place like the Netherlands. The next thing I want to talk about
So that was
related to racism relates to me being an Asian person in this country. One thing is a song that I recently learned about called Hanky Panky Shanghai.
Hanky Panky Shanghai, Hanky Panky, Hanky Panky, Hanky Panky.
Apparently this song was and is in some schools taught to children, and it's supposed to be a birthday song, but actually it's not about birthdays, and it's a song about, well, a lot of words imitating the Chinese language like hanky, panky, and Shanghai. And I've heard of stories of even kids being taught to pull their eyes back to imitate the chinky eyes. I don't know where this came from, and I don't know why this was taught in the educational system. And I don't know why. That's the big question. That's the big shock for me. We got some bread.
Yeah, so that was racism. Two interesting parts of that. The first part about the character Black Pete. That's something I've seen. I never really knew the name of it or what it meant. I've seen it mentioned here and there. What do you think about that as a Dutch person? And is that still celebrated like that today? Obviously, it's a big part of probably Netherlands culture and Netherlands history. I guess when they put on that blackface, they're not trying to do it negatively, I would guess. They're trying. It's just what's always been done. Do you think they should change it and use black people to do that? Do you think they should just stop that tradition? I can see both sides of it. Like, culture of a country is so important to always have these traditions and things, but in today's world, yeah, people might seem that or deem that as if offensive. Being Dutch, you probably have your own opinion, so I would love to hear that. The second part about him being Asian, living in Netherlands, which is probably majority white, and receiving racism, I do feel like I can talk about that in the opposite way. Being white, I've lived in Asia for the last 13 years. I've lived in China, Thailand and Malaysia. I've definitely received racism, been told to go back to my own country and things like that. When he mentions about them mimicking the Chinese accent, it's funny because people always mimic my accent and mimic the British accent. I don't find it offensive. I guess there's that argument about punching down. I don't really agree with that, because I feel anybody who says, oh, it's okay to punch down, or it's not okay to punch down, are automatically saying that someone's below someone else, where I just treat everybody equally. I just never be offensive. I don't take offense to things like that or receiving that abuse, but I can understand people who would feel offended, you know. So I feel like any country, every country I've lived in any country I've visited, there's always people who are racist. Some countries have a lot more people who are racist than others. Like here in Malaysia, racism is very institutionalized. There's 3 main races, and there's definitely racism. People, like, there's certain races that are not accepted into universities. There's certain like criteria based on race to get certain jobs and to be able to buy houses. That's institutionalized. That's terrible. It happens, but in countries like Netherlands and Western countries, although people say there's a lot of racism, compared to a lot of other countries, especially here in Asia, there's definitely not as much racism. That's my opinion, but I'd love to hear yours based on these ones.
We got some cheese, we got some bitterballen, mustard, and mayonnaise. This, my friends, is Dutch food. Kidding, but not really kidding. Dutch culture is not known for its food. But I was shocked coming to this country, and then not really, because I thought to my past, I had never had Dutch food before in the US or traveling anywhere. And there's probably a reason, because, well, this is Dutch food. It's not bad. I do like bitterballen. There's just not a lot of variety. I remember my first day in this country, I was in Maastricht for university. It was orientation day, and we had free lunches in the cafeteria, sandwiches. So I rushed to the cafeteria. There were bags of lunches on the table. I take my bag and go to my table, and I open up my bag. I look inside, and I see that there's something missing in my sandwich. So I go back to the table with the lady, and I asked her, hey, can I get a new sandwich because there's something missing in mine? And she responded, no, that's your sandwich, that's your lunch. It was a slice of cheese between 2 slices of bread. Needless to say, I was still hungry afterwards, so I went to McDonald's, I think, and I got a few burgers. But yeah, Dutch people, Dutch culture, not known for its food. If you work for a Dutch company, oftentimes you'll gather around a table, from what I hear, and people will just eat sandwiches. Oh, just give me a second. I was just scheduling in a lunch.
Yeah, so again, like that, I don't actually see a problem with that. I'm from the UK. We love sandwiches. Sandwiches is a very good lunch. It's healthy. If you compare to maybe Asian food, it's not as heavy, not as loaded with carbs, where you just eat a lot of rice and a lot of like different sauces and stuff like that. It's not as heavy. It's nice and light. You go back to lunch, after lunch and work, you can work, or in your studies, you can go back and study. It doesn't feel so heavy. Here in Asia, in Malaysia, definitely I have big lunches, and sometimes it's not the best idea. I go back to work and I feel like sleeping basically. But I feel like that, again, when you go to a country, not every country exports their food a lot, but it doesn't mean it's bad food. Like, I feel like Dutch or Netherlands does have a distinct and interesting and a good food culture. Again, maybe it's not as known to people outside of the country, but I really enjoy Dutch food when I go there, or when I've been to Netherlands. But I think people just have to be open, especially when you move to a different country. You just be like, okay, I'm just going to enjoy this. You have to have a positive mindset and then just try and enjoy it and explore the food they do have, you know?
Lunch 2 months from now, just like a Dutch person would. Because the Dutch, they love to schedule, they love to plan, and they don't plan only a few days in advance, but they plan months and sometimes years in advance for a lunch, a date, or anything. And Dutch people are not very spontaneous, so you almost never show up at someone's house unannounced. Now, just a generalization, but in many ways it's true. The Dutch people, they love to be efficient, they love to save time, and they love to plan. I remember trying to schedule a lunch with a Dutch friend, and almost every time they bust out their calendars and their agendas and they check, oh, you want to do lunch? Let me check. Oh, I have an opening 2 months from now. Let's do lunch then. And for myself, I think of myself as a planner, but I plan things maybe a few days, a week, a few weeks in advance, not 2 months in advance. And that was a big shock for me. There was another colleague I was talking to, and he was talking about his holidays, not for this year, but his summer holidays for next year. He had already booked his summer holidays for the next year. And I just found that extremely shocking. But in many ways, it's really nice because they're very organized, they love planning, but not so nice when you want to do things spontaneously. Dutch.
I feel like that's maybe like an individual thing. I don't think every single person in the Netherlands is so strict and not spontaneous. I think there's a variety, there's diversity within the Netherlands and any other country. For me, I love to be organized. I like that way of planning things. When that specific example of planning like the next year's holiday, that definitely makes sense to me, because the closer you leave it, the more expensive it is for hotels and flights. So planning far in advance just means you're getting the best deal, and it also gives you more time to plan what you're going to do on that holiday and so on. So it's just, I feel like that's a very sensible way to do it. I don't always do that myself. Sometimes I can leave things to the last minute, but I actually like that, and I think you see that with regards to industry in the Netherlands, things like engineering. People are very organized and it just works. So yeah, tell me if that applies to you, or are you more spontaneous?
Directness. The Dutch are some of the most direct people in the world, but don't confuse directness with rudeness. They're completely different things. You can find rude people from all over the world, but the Dutch, they just want to be honest and say what's on their minds. If you look at Erin Meyer's cultural scales, she's done years and years of research into cultural differences, and there's this low context and high context communication scale. And low context cultures like the US, Canada, and the Netherlands, they prefer precise, direct communication. High context cultures like Asian countries, African countries, many Latin American countries, it's really about knowing the context, and they tend to be more indirect. So there's also this other scale called the negative feedback scale, and this is where the Dutch are the most direct, even when it comes to negative feedback. And this is where Americans differ from the Dutch. Americans are very direct when it comes to low context communication, but when it comes to criticism, Americans are not so direct. This is probably where the Dutch get that reputation of being harsh. It's because they're honest. If it's negative feedback or positive feedback, it doesn't matter. They're extremely honest. So don't confuse rudeness with directness. The Dutch people, I find them extremely friendly, but they will say what's on their minds, positive or negative. Housing.
Again, I think that's a good thing as well. For me, if you're maybe in a work environment, even in your personal life, I would rather people are straight to the point with me. Whatever it is, if it's negative, positive, just I don't like that going out, taking like other ways to get around problems and things, and not want to be direct. Being direct just gets you places quicker, in my opinion. And as you can see, the UK is quite far down that. As much as I like to receive direction or information directly, to try and give it, I do sometimes feel like I don't want to be so harsh with people to give that negative feedback. So I try and wrap it up a bit nicely. So I can see differences even between the Netherlands and the UK. Of course, again, very much compared to Asia, where I live at the moment, which is on the other end of the scale. But tell me, if you're a Dutch person, are you very direct? How do you feel getting that negative feedback? Are you happy to accept it as much as you're happy to give it?
Is a nightmare.
House
It's
faces.
stressful. That was a big shock for me coming to this country. I didn't understand or know how competitive it was to find a place here. Even if you have money, it's still competitive. Whether you're a student, a full-time worker, whether you're renting or buying, it's going to be really hard to find a place to live in this country, especially in Amsterdam. Because once a listing goes live, you only have a few hours to respond to get a viewing. And if you get that viewing, you have to take time out of your day. It's usually one day and maybe 20 minutes or 1 hour. And if you don't go, then you miss the viewing and you don't get the place. And especially if you have a full-time job, it's really hard to take time out of your day to go to a viewing the next day. So I've never seen a market this competitive, and I come from San Francisco where it's extremely expensive. There's just not enough supply for the high demand here. So yeah, be on the lookout for that, because I'm currently looking for a 1-bedroom and I'm pretty stressed out. So just be aware that if you want to find a place to live, it's going to take a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of resilience. So if you
Yeah, and that does sound difficult. That's something I would find a problem. Obviously, when you do things like tasks like this, trying to find a property, you just want it to be over and done with as quickly as possible. So this sounds actually quite challenging. Do you find that in the Netherlands that it's quite challenging? Is it very different between somewhere like Amsterdam and the other smaller towns or the other cities? How expensive is rent and things like that as well? Actually, as an example from here in Malaysia, going back to the racism thing as well, to bring that back and just show the difference in racism. Here in Malaysia, there's 3 main races: the Malay, which is the majority, also Chinese and Indian, which make up about 20 or 30% all in. When different races are trying to rent a property, agents of another race will just dismiss them, say we don't rent to Chinese, we don't rent to Indian, we don't rent to Malay, based on the owner of the house if there's something else. So seeing things like that, it shows you how racist other countries can be and how there's other challenges with regards to things like property. But that does sound quite difficult. I want to know people's experience in the Netherlands, especially being Dutch. Is it that difficult for you?
you decide to rent, you might come across an apartment that's completely furnished, nice. You might come across an apartment that is not furnished but has floors. But you also might come across many apartments that have nothing at all, not even floors. It's called the shell. And that was a big shock for me coming to this country and going to viewings, that you had to buy your own floors and install your own floors.
Never seen that
the
before.
thing about that is it takes time and it takes some money to buy the floors. It might not cost a lot less than 1,000 euros from IKEA, but the time it takes to install the floors, you might pay someone a few thousand euros to install the floors too. And when you leave, you either have to take your floors with you or you sell your floors to the next tenant. So I don't know how I feel about that, but yeah, I never experienced that before. Definitely a shock. So when you go rent, be prepared to rent an apartment with no floors, where you have to buy your own floors and install your own floors. So yes, when you come to the Netherlands, you might see the canals, the architecture. You also see big windows, big open windows without curtains. And that was a big shock for me when I first came here. And I was walking along the canals, and then I saw inside the windows
you can see
what
inside, I
families
remember
were
that
doing.
also.
People working, people reading. And that's the shock for me, because there seems to be no privacy at all, but when you dig a bit deeper, it's tied to their culture. And it goes back to Calvinism, which basically says if you are an honest person, you have nothing to hide. So these open windows show that Dutch people have nothing to hide inside their homes. Also, the fact that when you open up your windows, you get more light in, and some people say that they feel more connected to the outside world when they open up their windows without curtains. So it might be a shock, but it's a pleasant shock when you come to the Netherlands. If you
Yeah, that is one thing I've noticed when you walk along the canals in the Netherlands and you can look inside people's houses. I guess if you're nosy, that's quite a good thing. You can have a look and see what people's houses are designed like. I never knew the root of that, going back to Calvinism and basically showing you have nothing to hide. I feel like that's an interesting part of Dutch culture that's very unique, I think. Is your house like this as well? Do you mind if people look in your house? Do you ever have a look in other people's houses? Or are you just so used to it that you just walk by now? Yeah, very interesting to learn about that, actually.
Want to see a doctor in the Netherlands, then you might have to exaggerate that you're almost dying. Well, I'm exaggerating, but not really. But I was shocked when I first came to this country and a lot of international friends told me advice. Hey, if you ever need to see a doctor, you need to exaggerate, because the culture here is that people don't go to their doctors for minor things like being sick with a cold, a flu, fever. They go to the doctors for big things. And that's very different compared to a place like the US where people go for annual checkups. They go to see the doctor because they're sick. But here, you go to the doctors for big things. If it's something minor, the doctor will tell you, go take some paracetamol, feel better, and set you off. And this pissed off a few of my friends because they did actually have quite it wasn't big, but it wasn't minor as well, issues, and the doctors, nurses turned them away. So you really have to exaggerate to get seen here. The other thing is that your GP, your general practitioner, your doctor, pretty much everything goes through your GP. And I learned this the hard way because in my first month here, I was at a park and I got bit by a dog, a pit bull. And luckily there were some police officers around and they were nice and caring. They told me to go next door to the hospital to get a tetanus shot. So I go to the hospital and I tried to get a tetanus shot, but the nurse turned me down because the bite wasn't big enough and told me to go to my GP. Unfortunately at that time I did not have a GP. That was my fault. But the nurse started like scolding me like, oh, why don't you have a GP? You should have a GP. And I was just shocked because, well, I was shocked because of the dog bite. And then the second thing was that I couldn't get treated, and she was scolding me at the same time. And yes, I know it was my fault, but I was just extremely shocked at that point in time. So lesson learned, everything goes through your GP. Register for a GP when you first arrive. And two, if you want to get seen by a doctor, then you really have to exaggerate what you have. If you need to...
Yeah, so I guess that's just that definitely is a difference in culture. It's the same in the UK. You must have like an assigned GP. I don't know if the hospital would turn you away in that instance. I'm not too sure. I do know in the UK at the moment, it's very difficult to even see your GP. It can take weeks because of a lack of staff and just a lot of people want to see doctors and things like that. But for me, I'm the kind of maybe the same as the Dutch where I just don't really go and see a doctor. I've lived in Asia for 13 years. I've never been to the doctor. I don't generally get too sick, but even if I get maybe like a food poisoning or feel like a fever, I'll just treat myself. I just don't want to basically bother the doctors because I know that I'll get better quite soon. So it's interesting to see that as well. What do you think about that one? What do you think about the way they dealt with him as well? Is that just that Dutch directness?
And you're in Amsterdam and you don't want to pay to use a toilet. Well, you're in luck because there are these public urinals in Amsterdam on busy streets, on the canals, and they're free.
This is a urinal and it's illuminated. It's like the most futuristic thing I've seen in this whole place. It's just you go and you just pee in it.
Okay, that one is quite open.
For free.
And it's part weird, but also part convenient as well, because sometimes you just need to go. And there's actually an app to track all these urinals in Amsterdam
never knew that,
as
actually.
well. They're very convenient. And what's weird is that, yeah, you just pee and you see the piss splattering on the ground. And what's even weirder is that there are these quadruple urinals, so 4 of them side by side, and you're just peeing next to 3 other guys on a public street while people are shopping around you. And so yeah, even in the UK we don't have those. That would be quite... I've seen that in I love my
Amsterdam, but never
coffee,
used.
but here's a quick tip. If you're in the Netherlands and you're looking for a coffee shop, don't ask for a coffee shop. That means something completely different here. That's a lesson that I learned. Coffee shops here are weed, cannabis, and marijuana shops. If you're looking for coffee, look for a cafe. Well, that's it for me when it comes to culture shocks.
Yeah, good advice there at the end, just in case anybody makes that mistake. That's something I've enjoyed in Netherlands, definitely. But yeah, interesting points there, especially the first couple, really interesting debates. I would love to know what people in the Netherlands think of those things and your opinions as well. But a lot to take in there. Tell me what you think about them. I definitely like these types of videos, so if there's any other ones like this with culture shocks that you think are interesting, please recommend them. I'll check them out also. But yeah, tell me what you think about the points raised in this. Thanks.